Hello and welcome. You're watching Profit Insights on NDTV Profit and I'm Pallavi Nahata. Now the MPC minutes were released and they continued to show divergence between the external members of the RBI and the RBI. Now essentially external members Jayant Verma and Ashima Goyal raised some concerns regarding the growth sacrifice as well as inflation being on a downward trend, while RBI, basically the Monetary Policy Committee members from the RBI, Shaktikanta Das, the RBI Governor, Michael Patra, the Deputy Governor, continued to raise concerns regarding high food inflation, how persistent it has been, and the importance of bringing down food inflation to control headline inflation and to maintain price stability. Today's conversation will be interesting because I'm joined by Ashima Goyal and by Jayant Verma. First, Ashima Goyal, the Emeritus Professor from IGIDR, and this was also her last policy as external member. Ma'am, thank you so much for taking time out for us.
You're welcome.
So, to begin with, a quick glance at the minutes appears to indicate that while you are confident relatively that inflation is transient because of the factors it is emanating from, on the other front, despite domestic growth having remained resilient, it is showing slight signs of weakness. So what is your take currently, and how does that sort of fit into the broader MPC mandate? I mean, the decision?
Yeah, we've seen that the July inflation came in at below 4, right? It's 4.54. So for the first time, the MPC has, the inflation is below the MPC's target. And while it's expected to rise again, but there's a very good monsoon. So that will be a dampener. And I think that we might be pleasantly surprised downwards by inflation in the future. And as for growth, I think growth is quite robust. In Q1, there is a softening, but that could be related to the elections and a pause in government spending, general uncertainty for the private sector. And so again, we are seeing signs of revival of consumption in rural areas also, which is very positive. But my point is that even if growth is robust, as long as trend inflation is downward, especially core inflation, which is the more long-run sort of pattern, less volatile part of inflation, then we are actually, we have room to grow further without raising inflation. So we are below our potential output. Even if growth is high, we can comfortably grow at a slightly higher pace without raising inflation. And since we have a large amount of unemployment and this is our catch-up period, we should try to grow at the maximum that we can, with of course, with macroeconomic stability.
Okay, all right. So, I do want to follow up on that. So, then would it be fair to say at this point, you don't believe that the growth sacrifice per se is too much? You do expect growth to pick up from Q1, given factors such as the monsoon and maybe on the back of that slightly better demand going forward. Would that sort of be the right way to look at it?
This is what a lot of people say, that growth is high, it is relatively robust, so there's no growth sacrifice. But the point I'm trying to emphasize is that our potential growth is even higher. So there is a growth sacrifice. Compared to last year, we are growing 1% slower. And we all know that China in its catch-up period grew in double digits, right? So in a period of structural change, you don't know what the potential output is. And if trend inflation is downwards, then that means that you are below your potential output. So to that extent, there is a growth sacrifice.
Got it,
also because
right.
it acts with a lag, right? If real interest today, especially in terms of core inflation, are pretty high, it's going to have an effect down the road. And at that time, it will be too late to do anything about it.
Okay, all right. That broadly explains your stance and your vote for a 25 basis points rate cut as well in this policy. But I do want to ask you once again on inflation, given that there has been a whole lot of debate once again in recent days over whether the MPC needs to probably then target core or look at core more specifically versus continuing to look at the headline. Would you have a perspective on that as well then?
Yeah, I had written this in a couple of minutes back that we should give forecasts of core as well as headline, right? Even though headline can remain our target, the MPC, but there should be more attention, explicit attention paid to core. Because core is the most, research shows it's the most stable part of inflation. It's the long-term trend. And my research shows that headline inflation converges to core, and households' expectations in the long run are influenced by core inflation. Yeah. So therefore, giving forecasts of core and aggregate demand, the real interest rate influences core directly. Doesn't influence volatile. It can influence food inflation only through expectations, etc. Right? So that is why I think it will help to anchor inflation expectations and for convergence of headline inflation to core if we give more attention to core in the monetary policy.
Got it. And another question, of course, that's sort of, something that we've been debating about for a while, is whether the current food inflation figures that we're seeing, whether that is, sort of spilling over into the non-food inflation component as well. But, from your commentary, would it be safe to assume that you continue to be of the opinion, and like you've mentioned, food inflation has shown signs of easing, inflation is on a downward trend, and hence possibly the spillover effect we're talking about might not be so much of a concern? Would that be right?
Yes, because if you look at the core inflation components, there's no broad-based inflation. The slight rise we saw in momentum this month was just due to the telecom price rise. And we are seeing overall global commodity prices softening, as well as our own inflation. Our own monsoon is good. So I don't see any signs of broad-based uptick in core inflation. In fact, this is a point I make, and I want to emphasize here that there is a view, a conservative view, the view in the RBI, and because inflation is their main objective, it is that it will revert, core inflation will revert. They expect it to revert to mean. But the point is that we have seen trend inflation coming down in India over the last 10 years as we've had inflation targeting. And so that mean is downwards now. It's not the old mean, So even though core is at a lifetime low of 3.1 and services score is 2.7, maybe they rise, but why do you think that they will rise above the target? The target should have a signaling and anchoring effect. Yeah. Right. And since the inflation has been down the past 10 years, we can expect core to trend, not to revert to its old mean. Yeah.
Right.
So
okay. Right. Please continue. Okay, no, so just to understand that better, so broadly, while core inflation might have bottomed out and while we do expect future prints to print a tad higher, core inflation is still not necessarily a point of concern that the MPC needs to worry about because it is expected to remain range bound at about the 4% target. Would that be right?
In the longer run, even if it reverts to a mean, I don't think a mean will be above 4. Yeah, and it might continue because the other thing is when we say that aggregate demand affects core, and real interest rates have been around 1 in terms of head repo rate, but we have large spreads in the Indian system. So industry borrows, consumers borrow at higher rates. So these real rates have kept demand sort of muted and brought down core inflation to 3 below the target, right? So now as inflation falls, the real interest rate is rising and monetary policy is becoming more restrictive. Then if you think that this real rate really affected core inflation in the past, you would expect core inflation to fall further. Yeah? And that means further softening of demand, further sort of negative impulse to growth, no? Which is not what the Indian economy needs at this point in time. Moreover, the target, again, paying more attention to core means that, the RBI, the MPC, we are the agents of the population, the voters who have elected a government who gives us the target we have to aim for. So it is not correct for us to have a core inflation that is below the target.
Okay.
Yeah?
All right. Okay. So, in your last minutes as well, you had some interesting commentary and you spoke about how the inflation figure itself can also be an indicator of growth potential. This time around as well, you did highlight that, while growth is broadly resilient despite some signs of weakness in Q1, it still remains below its potential. Could you explain a little bit more on that?
This is a very simple point, but people seem to find it very difficult to appreciate. See, the idea is, I've highlighted, and recently the RBI came out with its estimates of the neutral interest rate, the natural interest rate, the equilibrium rate at which inflation is expected to be at target and output at potential. Yeah, and they are saying that this will be rising as growth rises. I'm saying that there are theoretical reasons in a country such as India, where we are in transition, this will not necessarily happen. We're also seeing spreads come down with more financial stability and less volatile, more stability in the macroeconomy in general, right? So there are controversies in measuring this neutral or equilibrium rate, yeah? So you can judge what it is by looking at inflation. There is a literature on this, it says what are potential indicator variables. And among those is inflation, growth, etc. So inflation primarily, if inflation is below the target, it means that your actual policy rate is above equilibrium, right? Because the inflation is heading below target, core inflation is below target, yeah? And if inflation is below target, that means you are at below potential output. Your output is lower than it could be because inflation is below the target. Yeah. So this is just a simple indicator to cut across all the controversies in measuring equilibrium interest rates by saying that the inflation trend itself allows you to infer something about what the natural or neutral equilibrium interest rate is, where potential output is, where output is related to potential. Yeah, is that clearer?
Absolutely. Yes, thank you so much for that explanation. But ma'am, this was also your last MPC as external member. You also summarized some of the principles for the MPC. And I do want to understand, is this also, was this also one of the meetings which saw greater divergence between the external and the internal members of the RBI? And what does one make of this dissent in that case?
Well, again, I have some research which suggests that dissent is very healthy. It's good for the economy, for analysts like you, and generally it forces you to think more.
Absolutely.
And question your assumptions. And, because you play a large role, you give feedback to all of you, they say that inflation and, rates need to be higher and there's no need for a cut. That affects and influences the Reserve Bank also. So these arguments are for you also to think, right? What are our priorities today? We just got a stable government. We are in a position to grow. And for political stability, it's very, very important to increase employment. That is a priority for us. So there's no reason to keep monetary policy, especially since aggregate demand is very interest sensitive in an economy like India with a lot of young people. There's no need to keep monetary policy tighter than necessary to bring inflation to target and to allow growth to rise to potential. right?
Right.
And divergence, we have a very healthy discussion, and I've also put on record that I think the RBI is one of the pillars of the economy, and we have to thank the policies of the past 3 years for allowing India to be in one of the fastest growing and most stable macro, one of the emerging markets that's doing the best around the world today. Yeah. One of the larger economies that's doing the best. Yeah. And I'm sure it will go on doing what's the best for the economy, but all of us can give an input in that. And in general, I would say that we've had a lot of agreement in this MPC, but points of dissent have not been when there are turning points. A lot of people can disagree on when you need to change, whether you're tightening or you're loosening. The pandemic time, everybody agreed you needed to cut rates. Then again, there was some divergence because external members felt rates should have been, tightening should commence a little earlier than so.
All right. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking time out for us. This was most helpful as always.
You're welcome.
We're now joined by Jayant Verma, external member of the Monetary Policy Committee. Mr. Verma, thank you so much for taking time out for us.
Oh, my pleasure.
So, to begin with, from your latest minutes, and that's something that you've been saying for a while, what stands out is that you sort of talk about the growth sacrifice that's taking place because of not cutting rates at the correct juncture. And also the fact that in Q1, for instance, we are seeing very visible signs of slight weakening in growth. So could you elaborate a little bit more on that, the growth sacrifice as well as weaker growth that we're seeing in Q1?
You see, growth, one has to look at, there are two ways to look at growth. One is the obvious fact that we are the fastest growing large economy in the world, and we will probably be the fastest growing large economy in 25-26 as well. That is beyond doubt. But the other question is, what is the rate of growth that India needs at this point? Where do we stand in the demographic transition? And what kind of growth rates have countries had at the same point in their demographic transition? China, for example, when it was going through a similar stage of its demographic transition, was growing at 11-12%. That is the growth that is possible because there are new entrants to the workforce. The workforce is expanding. There is need for creating employment. The economy has to grow a lot faster during those periods when the labor force is rapidly expanding. And then 7% is not enough. We need to grow more than 8%. So that is one side of it. The other side is, what is the growth rate that the Indian economy is capable of? What are the barriers to that growth? And I think we have gone through a series of reforms in the last several years. The digitalization of the economy, the investment in public infrastructure, all of that steps up the potential growth rate of the economy. So whether you look at it in terms of the growth rate that we need or the growth rate that India is capable of, that would be a number in excess of 8%. And then you put 7% against that, what you come up with is that the fastest growth rate in the world is still not good enough. And one of the things that is probably holding back growth is excessively restrictive monetary policy. And we need to be on the guard against that and avoid excessive growth sacrifice at this point of time. The problem is that if an economy gets habituated to 7% growth, then everybody starts thinking that that is the growth that the economy is capable of. And then 7% becomes a ceiling because everybody thinks we can't grow faster than 7. It is necessary to break that perception, to bring in the confidence that we can grow at 8 and above. And therefore, I think the opportunity is there right in front of us in the next couple of years to step up our growth rate significantly. And we should not let monetary policy stand in the way.
Right. And the obvious sort of revert to that point regarding the growth sacrifice has been that at the current juncture, the food inflation continues to be persistent to the point that it may now be having spillover effects to headline inflation, and that's been the rationale that's been given for the RBI members, including the governor and the deputy governor, standing by their decision to hold a status quo on the benchmark lending rate. You've, of course, in your commentary also spoken about how inflation is on a downward trend, but how are you then looking at food inflation? Do you think that it is not endemic? We had Ashima Goyal right before you, and she does believe that it is indeed transient. So what's your stance on all of that?
See, what we know about food inflation is that it is very volatile. And transient is another way of describing the same thing. It goes up and down quite a lot from quarter to quarter. So when you look at projections, you see the headline inflation jumping up and down, and it jumps up and down to a great extent because food inflation is jumping up and down. What we have seen in the last year or more is that with restrictive monetary policy, food inflation has not spilled over into core. This is the very clear empirical evidence of the last year or so. Even when we had very high food inflation, that did not spill over into headline. And I think it will not spill over to headline in the coming year as well, for multiple reasons. One is that we have an inflation targeting regime, and there is credibility of that regime. And people will realize that, yes, if inflation goes up, restrictive monetary policy will bring it down. So we will never get into that vicious cycle of food inflation producing high core and then high core producing more inflation and so on. An inflation targeting regime breaks that spiral. We saw that effective last year, which will be effective in the coming years as well. And a lot of food inflation is transient. A lot of it is happening in vegetables where the harvest cycle is very short. You can get a bad tomato crop today, and in 2 months' time or 3 months' time, you would have a new crop coming in, and you get a supply response, right? That if tomato prices are high, then more people are going to sow tomatoes, and you will get more supply in the next harvest 3 months down the line. So all of these structural reasons make one believe that food inflation will be transient. It is not that there is something inherent about food inflation that makes it transient. It is that with a proper macroeconomic environment, it will be transient because of adequate supply response and because restrictive monetary policy prevents it from spilling over into core. That is really the logic.
All right. Okay. So, this was your last monetary policy meeting as an external member. I do want to understand, what your thoughts are more broadly regarding the recent debate that actually we have every now and then regarding whether we should target core more specifically rather than headline, or maybe take that into account more than we currently do. So I do want to understand your stance on that as well. And also, given that this was your last, meeting that you attended as an external member, would you have preferred a rate cut this time around at least? That's something you've been batting for a while now.
No, I think it's important to recognize that these are collective decisions that we are taking as a committee. We decide, and the important thing is what is right for the economy at a particular point of time, and we should not let personal preferences, that in the last meeting I must have my way or something. That is completely the wrong way of looking at it. At every meeting, first, last, or in the middle, the task that we have is to do what is right in our best judgment, to our best ability, what is the best thing for the economy. Okay, that is the way that I look at this. What I also think is that, as an MPC, we have been given a statutory mandate to keep headline inflation within the band of 4 plus minus 2. Now, as a statutory body entrusted with this mandate, I think it would be completely inappropriate on our part to go around talking about what the target should be. We are given a target, our job is to implement the target, right? If you are the head constable of a police station, your job is not to talk about what the Indian Penal Code ought to be. Your job is to implement the Penal Code as it stands. So that is the way the MPC should look at it. We are given a statutory target. We have to adhere to that. We can't go about complaining that this is not the right target. We knew that the headline inflation was our target when we took over as the MPC. If we didn't like it, we could have said we are not joining the MPC. The moment we joined, we accepted this mandate, we accepted this as the target, and our job is to just go and try to implement the target. That's the way I look at it.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Verma, for taking time out for us. We do hope to continue to speak to you going forward post this as well. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to NDTV Profit. We have more coming up.